welcome to the second session of 3 for our, mini trip through the Beatitudes. And as we start today, we're going to be talking specifically about 3 of the Beatitudes. And, there's always been debate as to whether there's 8 or 9 or 10. It's hard in the English to kind of parse out 10. A lot of people say 9, but I like to think there might have been 10. There might have been an intention of 10, since it's so clear that Matthew sets Jesus up to be the new Moses going back up to the mountain to present the new kind of communication from God, And so there's something parallel between the Beatitudes and the 10 Commandments, but it's a little difficult in English. It's kind of funny that you were Patty and Horty were talking about Aramaic and just the way when you get into some of the original language, some of this might become a little more clear, but it doesn't lead us to that clarity when we have English translation. Nonetheless, just to expand upon and maybe recap some of what we talked about in terms of how we understand the Beatitudes. What are they meant to be? So the Beatitudes, as we talked about last week, there is this ethical responsibility that's inherent in them. Okay, we're not meant to sort of just hear them and receive them in our heart so that we get that warm, fuzzy feeling. It really is about a willing donning of the clothing of the Beatitudes and sort of being the Beatitudes. So that's an important piece, and we talked about that, because the idea is that to be blessed as an individual, but more largely as a community, means that we don't just sit back. We engage. We move forward. We step into that responsibility. So there's a clear sense of responsibility here. Also, there's this idea that the Beatitudes themselves are what's called performative language. Okay, and that's it sounds a little maybe oblique to say that, or obscure, but it means that they're not just talking about stuff that already exists, but they're talking about how when you do this, you bring about what the Beatitude is talking about. So when you practice mercy, you create more mercy. You receive that. When you practice some of these things, when you are poor in spirit, in alignment and in solidarity with all of those who are poor, you help to create a system of more justice. You see how I'm talking? So there's this performative element to the Beatitudes. The truth of the Beatitudes, especially for Matthew, but truly in Luke as well, the truth of them is not just because they're written in this sort of proverbial style, but they're rooted in the one who's saying them. So the authority that they get from Matthew and then from us, because of where we're coming from, is because Jesus said them. And Jesus in Matthew is a spokesperson for God. So again, they function in a similar way as the 10 Commandments, that communication from God through the prophet. And so there's a weight there. There's a responsibility, and maybe more so, there's an obligation. Okay, I want to be careful about how we use that word, but there's something more weighty about these words because of who is saying them. And then also I want to say this: these are not 9 ways that you can get to heaven. When you practice this, okay, well, how will I get there? How can I be blessed? I think I'll be merciful today. It's not about that. It's not something that appears in a vacuum, but remember that in both Matthew and in Luke, ooh, that was nice. In Matthew and in Luke, they're spoken to a committed community of followers. Okay, so they're not just for everybody in the world, but they're really for those who seek to be followers of this one whom we follow. This is what it looks like. That's a very important distinction. So these are not something that we can pick and choose, that sort of thing. But no, they all describe what the Jesus life looks like, what the life of mutual thriving and blessing looks like. So it's not, again, it's not just something that I get and, oh, wow, it's so wonderful to live this way. Okay, that's a part of it. That does happen. It's just not the totality. What makes it total, what makes it complete, is that paying it forward, that connection to community, because Matthew is very clear on this through his whole gospel. It is never about life oriented for me. It's always about life oriented for the mutual betterment of the community. That's what it's about. I mean, that's truly in every gospel, that's what it's about. So it's not about an individualism, it's about a community. Okay. Today we're going to be talking about the meek, the hunger and thirst for righteousness and mercy. And none of these appear in the Luke version. And that's not to say much. It's not, they're different. They're really seeking to do different things. There's a lot of speculation as to why Luke didn't include it. Some say that Luke was written earlier. That could be. It also could be that Matthew draws at least two of these, the merciful one and the meek one, almost directly from the Psalms. So it might be that Luke thought those were already obvious. Well, that may or may not be true. I don't really know. But we don't have parallels today in Luke for what we're covering. So we'll be focusing on the Matthew portion exclusively today. So that is sort of that kind of get us back into the soil of this study. Are there any comments, reflections, things left over from last week, or other things you're excited about that you'd like to share before we get into the further discussion? Patty.
Okay.
There you go.
So I really am interested in the Aramaic understanding. And so I bought a book called The Aramaic Light on the Gospel of Matthew. And it's exciting to read it in terms of the Beatitudes. But one of the things contextually that's exciting, especially in relation to mercy and all of that, is that Jesus went to Galilee. And that's where he started his teaching. And Galilee is a place where they had a lot of revolts. They had, just before he was born, they had the revolt with Theudas and Judas was put down. And I never understood how much there was turmoil. I mean, they said it all the time that they were repressed. But this whole idea of needing comfort because of mourning, I didn't understand the broadness of that at all. And especially in Galilee. Galilee is a place where there were many people from Babylon, descendants from Babylon, and they were seen as a warlike people, more warlike and more contentious. And so there was more revolts up there, and there were more people getting harmed. So to have him set his teaching there seemed very important. And it makes the Beatitudes different for me. It makes them more powerful, because when I looked up in this book, they have a chart on how many people were poor. It was about 95% of the people.
Right.
That's a huge number of people to be poor. And poor was also, according to the Aramaic, poor was not just poor without land. It was also the poor that could stay with God were seen as very holy people. And so it has different connotations that way. That's quite interesting.
Yeah.
And there's more of it. I don't want to dominate this, but it's really exciting. It's really exciting. And it's a different perspective than I got in seminary.
Well, and I can't remember if we talked about it. I think it was a part of the context of the Lord's Prayer when we did that, but it might have been this one. It's funny how time goes. But anyway, the context, the timing of Jesus' ministry, as Patty's indicating, a lot of it happened during the time of Herod Antipas, who was the successor to Herod the Great. And he was trying to basically make a name for himself within the Roman Empire. And what he managed to do was piss everybody off. Okay, so he became kind of an anathema within the Roman Empire because he was trying to do everything for everybody. And then he also became hated in his own people because basically he was talking out of both sides of his mouth. He changed the entire economy. He moved towards being a more heavily producing economy so that they could increase the tax base for Rome, which earned them favor. But then he did other things that tried to appease people within Israel because he didn't want to keep sparking revolts, but they continued to happen because, as Patty indicated, poverty went way up when Herod Antipas took over. And it was partly because of this practice of the larger conglomerate type farms buying out the smaller, long-standing family farms. Now, this is not a new practice. It's called latifundialization. It was something that the prophets in the Old Testament dealt with. Amos, Micah, and Hosea, for example, these are practices of basically squeezing wealth into a small minority and then, or squeezing it out of the majority and then creating a lot of indebtedness. So this is true. This is why we speak of the importance of forgiveness of debt and what that means to one's sense of freedom and wholeness and ability to participate in society. So all of this was happening. And as Patty mentioned, Galilee was really at the crossroads of the Roman Empire. All like 4 significant trade routes went through Galilee. So it's this small area that is so significant because so much is happening there. There's so many ideas being shared. There's so many different people coming through, but there's a lot of commerce coming through. And so it ends up being this place that is kind of an interesting place culturally, politically, socially, all those things. And certainly a part of that is because of its foment for discord, because of all the different socio-political things happening. So all of this is behind some of what, it's what gives energy to the Beatitudes. And I think it also, as Patty's indicating here, it colors it more towards, and maybe we know this already, but more towards the area of justice, of enacting justice and fairness and equality and standing up in solidarity with those who have been squeezed out, who have not. Okay, it's a very specific thing. And it's interesting because sometimes when we read Matthew, his way of speaking, at least in the English translation, can come across as a bit of a softening, almost like he's speaking to a middle-class group of listeners or something, that he doesn't want to just sort of speak maybe as directly as, say, Luke does. Some people comment on that. I don't necessarily think that's fair, because I think that some of that is more translation, and that he is trying to encourage a very much justice-oriented, get in there and stand up for your brother and sister kind of approach to these things. That's what the Beatitudes is for. So thank you for that initiation, that entry into that context, Patty. Did you want to follow up?
May I say one more thing?
Sure.
One of the things that this particular translation talked about is that the Pharisees, the people had been oppressed for 500 years, and they were, it was the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Greeks and the Romans, and probably a few others in there. And the Pharisees saw themselves still as the elite of God, that they were the carriers of the truth. And they held on to that, even though that wasn't the reality that they were living. And they tended to not like foreign peoples, and they wanted to keep their position of power. And Jesus seemed to be coming to say, the law, the rules of the law is not what it's about. It's the kingdom of God is inside of us and outside of us and all over us. And that's a new vision. And it must have been terribly scary for them. I mean, it's a real confrontation to their authority and mostly to their understanding of who God is. And it must have been difficult for everybody else too, because the way that these are the Beatitudes are the first times that it's only 4 apostles that were there. They're the first ones. He hadn't gathered the rest of them. And he's telling them what the kingdom of God is like, right? And to hear that, it never dawned on me how radical it was, how and probably confusing. And that these particular Beatitudes, like you said, are about praxis. They're not about thought. They're about living it. And some of the Aramaic is saying that they're talking about, like I said last week, that it's blissful. You get to be blissful if you do this. It's like when you're in the kingdom of God, not only does life change outside, but you change inside. You change to a happier person. And that makes me think of when Jesus said, I've come to give you life and life more abundant, that you get to be better people. And that just, I mean, I could go on forever and I better stop. I'm sorry. There's just so much here that I'm so excited by it.
Yes. And it is. And that's what we talked about last week too, is that, that we've received the word happy, and that can be true, but it's also one, it's more about we find our fulfillment as whole human beings when we live into these, because to be able, we talked about the gift of mourning last week. And, there's an aspect of the Beatitudes where we sort of, it's about other people and those in mourning, and that we might be a part of lifting them out of mourning. That might be a part of this. But what I also hear very strongly is that it's a gift and a blessing to be able to mourn and to intentionally practice that, because our ability to grieve is part of our ability to love. And that outside of that, we've truncated part of our humanity. And so each one of these invites us into those deeper spaces of what it means to be a human being, and specifically a human being in this model that Jesus is talking about in relationship to him and in relationship to one another. So it really is powerful stuff here. And I agree. I think a lot of us, we read the Bible and maybe we hear this stuff. I don't think it's new that, like, we've talked about how radical the Gospels are, but really there's certain times in our lives when it finally sinks in and it hits us. And that's just how it works. It's like the rich young ruler. We hear that story and, it's like, yeah. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, that's me. And there's finally a time where it's like, oh my gosh, that's not just someone else. This is about my reflection and how I live and what I give myself to, where I put my ultimate interest, what I say with my mouth versus what I live with my life. That's a challenge for all of us, not as a finger point, but as an invitation to live this way, because it leads us to a more whole, complete life, faith, and connection to God and one another. So that is, it is exciting, because as we get into this, sometimes we see and we're like, oh my gosh, I never realized that beatitude might be talking about this as well. So that, to me, that's why Bible study is very exciting. Any other comments or questions, Bonnie?
This might be going off topic a little bit, but it reminds me of Becca's children's sermon, which was an adult sermon on Sunday, but talking about, she asked how many of us had been out of the state, how many of us had been out of the country, and most of us in our church had been out of the country, which was not necessarily percentage-wise how it is in the entire country of the entire population. But the point being, looking at other people, at other cultures, at other surroundings that people are living in besides just our own little world here. And I think it kind of really hit home. We were driving home talking about it, and I said, well, just look in our country, look at our two neighbors, Mexico and Canada. What a difference in how many of those people live in just those two countries, let alone all the rest of the world. And so maybe that's off topic, but it just kind of gets me thinking about how important it is for us to look at people who are either immigrants or people living in other countries that are having very different experiences than what we have had as Americans growing up here and living here our entire lives.
Yeah, I think it's actually very much on topic, Bonnie, because the Beatitudes are intended to draw us outside of our navel gazing and to lift our eyes and our attention and our hands to our neighbors that are extended throughout the world, truly. And that was really what this past Sunday was about, wasn't it? With the sermon and her children's time, children with wrinkles time. So anyway, yes, that's all connected, and that is where we're drawn. I hope as we consider these Beatitudes here. Anyone else that has any comments or questions? Or Marilyn?
When you were describing Galilee and when Patty was talking, and I realized, I feel very blessed an awful lot of the time, but it's not because these sorts of things are addressed. It's because of something like how wonderful and helpful my daughters are, and sort of that kind of thing. And yet I'm living in a time that's not all that unlike the way I'm hearing Galilee described, for different reasons, but and so anyway, it's a wonderful reminder to me that I am definitely in the position of giving rather than needing to receive. There have been other times in my life where I have been poor of spirit and, some of these other things where I did need help. But this isn't one of them. And it's wonderful to be reminded of that.
Yes, it is. And I agree with you. I think, even that, as we said last week, the poor in spirit is one that we can identify with because we maybe felt that sense of longing, that sense of being in the pit. But also I want to accentuate again how being poor in spirit is what you just named, a willingness to enter into the reality of what poverty is for another and within myself. And when we live that way, we are in spirit, we are in solidarity with those who are around us. And when we are in solidarity, we are aware, we're connected. You can't live in a bubble if you're really living in solidarity, if you are in spirit with those who are around you. So there's something very, very powerful about even that one Beatitude. And that's each one of them in their own way invites us into that multi-layered savoring of meaning. So yeah, I think it's it may put us in that position of recognizing, wow, I would like to live into my abundance and generosity more out of this. That's wonderful. But it's also wonderful to say, I really will open myself to receiving that abundance and bounty, because it's always cyclical, isn't it? It's never just one. And the degree to which we can kind of hold that space for opening to receive and to give is that it almost greases the wheels of that paying it forward, and it just kind of makes things flow, in a more abundant, natural way. But yeah, all these are great reflections, great contextualizing as we get into today's conversation. Anyone else before we get into the brief reading we have for today? Okay. Well, thank you all for that. Because it's so short, I'm just going to read it. All we're going to be covering today is the Matthew portion of the Beatitudes here. And here they are. Can you all see that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So today we're just covering Matthew 5-7, chapter 5, verses 5-7. And the three Beatitudes are, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Very simple, and yet a lot of richness there. and maybe richness that we hadn't considered before. So let's go ahead and dive right in. The word meek, it's such a perfect word, because to say the word meek makes you feel kind of meek. But it's one of those words that's it's loaded. And I want to start by just saying, what are some of the things that the word meek connotes for you? Okay, don't try to tell me what you think I want to hear. Just when you hear the word meek, what comes up for you? What connotations do you get?
Shy.
I heard Margaret. What? Go ahead.
Shy.
Shy. Yeah. Kind of like, oh, yeah. Good. Bonnie.
Passive.
What was?
Passive.
Oh, passive. Yeah.
Not
Sort of
aggressive.
Right. Not aggressive. Okay.
Fearful.
Fearful. Yeah.
Someone who doesn't retaliate.
Yes. Someone who doesn't retaliate. All of these are right. In terms of this is what meek is. But here's what it is. A lot of us have received, and I don't want to cut anyone off, but I think we get where it's going. We have this idea that meek means something along the lines of insignificant compared to you. You know, that, oh, well, I'm just here. I don't want to insert myself to, that sort of quality of being, and the funny thing is, it is that, and yet it is not that at all. And in fact, this particular beatitude appears to be drawn directly from Psalm 37, verse 11, where it says, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the land." Okay, that's from Psalm 37. And the Hebrew word for meek there is anavim, which, interesting enough, is the same word that would be translated as poor in spirit. But that's sort of a separate conversation. But what it connotes, what it communicates here, is that meek is not about being insignificant and being silent onto the side, and I don't want to, that sort of voice even that I'm putting on. No, it's not that at all. To be meek is actually someone who has power and has authority, but consciously and willingly refuses to lord it over others. Now, that's quite different than our connotations of meek, isn't it? And the truth is, it's understandable that we look at the word meek that way, because we live in a society that doesn't value meek. People condemn meek when it comes to equality within, say, a leader. Meek is simply someone who refuses to exalt themselves over another. Okay, so it was meek of President Obama to bow when he shook the Prime Minister of Japan's hand. But remember how the press just got all up in arms about it. And I don't mean to, that's just one example. It's just what I remember. So much commentary about, oh, how dare the president of the greatest country in the world bow to another leader. It's like, we have this understanding of leadership and strength and power that has so much to do with dominance. And yet the word meek is very much caught up in one who knows one's power and one's authority and refuses to wield it as a weapon. Any other commentary about that idea? Or had you ever heard, or had you considered the word meek in a broader way like that too?
The one person described in the Old Testament as meek is Moses.
Interesting. Now, Moses is not someone we would think of as meek by that initial set of definitions at all. I mean, my goodness, he killed someone. He was a hothead. He fought against God. He argued with God. He was just not meek in so many of those definitions, but where it came to wielding authority, where it came to wielding his power, he was an embodiment of a meek leader. What other leaders can you think of? What other ones that you know of embodied that meek way of leading?
Martin Luther King, Cesar Chavez, and Gandhi.
Yes, thank you. Those are three powerful modern examples. Saint Francis was one who was famous.
Saint Francis, yeah.
Yeah, for claiming meekness as his model. And he said he went to the point of saying, I don't want to own anything, because I understand that when I start focusing on all the things that I own, that I possess, I lose my openness to the experience of wholeness. My possessions come to possess me. I mean, we realize this. I think we know this here more often than we really live it here, but he really embodied that meekness because he didn't want other interests to control him, to limit his experience, his openness to the flow of God, to the reality of God, to the abundance of God in his life. And I think we can see how that can happen. So he was one who embodied some of the qualities of meekness. Well, clearly I'll answer it, because just like any children's sermon, the answer is always Jesus. So that's one of them. Certainly he is the example, par excellence here of the meek ruler. And in fact, I think of that, it's called the Christ hymn that Paul writes about Jesus in the beginning of Philippians. And it just where he says that though he was in the form of God, he did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited. Such powerful, specific language. That is meekness right there. That's in Philippians 2, verse 6. Okay. And I include that in the notes, but read that Christ hymn that Paul lifts up to be read or perhaps sung in relation to Christ. It's a way of being in the world that knows one's power and authority and refuses to wield it in a way of dominance, in a way of power over. Other comments or questions, Jane?
It made me think of humility and empathy in a leader.
Yes.
And a quieter strength that demonstrates humility and empathy.
And that's true. And that is, may we say it this way, that is real strength, isn't it? Mm-hmm. When we have to lord it over, when we have to use muscle or yelling, whether it's in our parenting or whether it's in world leadership, we know we have lost some of our authority. We've lost some of our power. We're missing something because we're having to basically use force to make something happen, where true strength, true power, emerges in that meekness that refuses to go to those places of, well, call them violence on in one way or another. Was there another hand? Ken, and then Bonnie, and then Patty.
I love how the Message paraphrases this one. You're blessed when you're content with just who you are, no more, no less. That's the moment you find yourselves proud owners of everything that can't be bought.
Oh my gosh, that's so beautiful. And it really picks up on that whole, the St. Francis approach to this, that way of being meek. It's sort of like, I heard someone use an example of, how wonderful it is to have a public library where we can just go and enjoy. We don't have to own it. Okay, sure, we pay taxes, whatever. But we don't worry about owning all those books. We go and enjoy them. Or one of those free art galleries or something. We can there are things in this world that we need not possess. And when we can be open to the experience of life in the abundance of what is present and not need to do this and claim it all for ourselves, that is meekness. That is the strength that is meekness. Bonnie, and then Patty.
It just reminded me of something else, which is not what I was gonna say. So I'll try to say them both real quick. What I was thinking of was how it shows respect for other people. For instance, I was thinking American women visiting the Middle East and wearing a burqa out of respect, not because we have to. We could go in and say, we don't have to do this. This isn't our culture, but it's respect for them. Certain countries, you know, you don't walk around in shorts. Just because we can do it here, it shows respect for the other culture. But then what that reminded me of, what Ken was saying, and wasn't really a leader, but if you saw the movie Getty about John Paul Getty, he was all about possessing all this artwork, everything for himself. He had various strange relationships with his family, but he was just buying more and more, millions and millions and millions. And part of the reason that we have, you know, the Getty art galleries and so forth is that all that's donated, because he just hoarded it. But in the end, he had no relationships with anybody. He had one guy that he paid to work for him, but his family, well, he was completely estranged from his family and from everybody else, because it was more and more and more for himself.
Yeah. And ultimately, after enough time, you know, after we're gone from this life, we don't possess anything anyway. It's also transient. So yeah, and he created a blessing out of what I would look back at and say, wow, you know, would he have done it differently? You know, that kind of thing. But anyway, it's about the redemption there in creating something for others to enjoy. But yeah, thank you for those comments. Patty?
I was thinking about the teachings of the Highlander Center and how Rosa Parks and others benefited from that. And that was a teaching about nonviolence, and which is at the heart of meekness. It's a non-retaliative response to violence, and how we can learn meekness, how we can learn what the qualities of it are, to become more in that place that Ken was talking about, where we're satisfied with the relationship to others and to God, and how that is all interrelated, rather than to things. And so those people that took the time to go to the Highlander Center and learn those processes that Gandhi taught and that Jesus taught, they're really models who didn't start out meek, but developed it. And that's heartening for me in my journey.
And I think it's intended to be heartening for any of those who Matthew is directed toward. Yeah. And that would be us. We're the second level, okay? As Patty said, this is spoken to a select group of disciples, you know, who have already agreed to commit their lives, but we're looking over their shoulder, and we're part of that too. So we're part of that invitation. And it's true that one learns how to be. It's not just something you can become, or that maybe that you're naturally born into. In fact, a lot of this is, you know, kind of the opposite of what we've been taught our whole lives. So you learn how to do it. And then, as it says, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. You know, it leads to something. But what does it mean to you when you hear that phrase? What does it mean to inherit the earth? Horty?
Isn't for me, but from the prayers of the cosmos. You were talking earlier about, in response to what Marilyn said, being in the time of really welcoming and receiving the gifts that others give, and sometimes being in the place of enormous generosity and the ebb and flow of that within ourselves, I think is well addressed by one of the translations of this. Healthy are those who have softened what is rigid within. They shall receive physical vigor and strength from the universe. So as you soften one's ability to be strong, there's the possibility of the inflow of what we can inherit from the universe.
Well, and I think that does correlate well, because much like soil, when it's hard and packed and, you know, rigid, it doesn't grow anything. You have to loosen it up. You have to make it supple. It needs to be able to receive in order for things to grow in it. And to inherit the earth, you know, I feel like a lot of us, when we read these Beatitudes on a cursory level, or maybe the way we were taught them, we think of that as, oh my gosh, there's your reward. Oh, you're going to get this windfall. If you just hang in there, you know. And it's not that at all. To inherit the earth means it's a responsibility. That those who are meek are uniquely equipped in much those qualities that you just named, Horty, and others have been talking about, uniquely equipped to be able to perceive the world that we all have received, to steward it well, and to hand it forward to the next generation. Those who are meek are uniquely qualified to do this because they don't look at the earth as a means for their enrichment, or at least their possession of enrichment, that it's a treasure. It's an incredible gift that we've been given, and then a responsibility. And only those with a meek mindset will not wield the resources that the earth has in such abundance in ways that create all of these divisions and strifes and things that we've acknowledged and we've lived in our lives. There is a unique quality that meekness allows in terms of they then will inherit the earth because they know inherently what it means to live in ways that create enrichment and blessing for all, and then hand that on. Questions or comments about what it means to inherit the earth, Bob, or anything else?
Well, my interpretation of that is earth is a very basic thing, and I interpret it as being the meaning of coming to understand the meaning of life. Yeah,
I think that's true. And that the meaning of life is so much bigger than the little circle or the smaller ways that many of us tend to live, or maybe that we were taught to live. And that's so true. All of these Beatitudes are trying to break open the circle, or to ripple out that circle of what life looks like, to recognize the power and the impact that we have when we are in communion with one another and with God. Patty?
It must have been extremely challenging for all the people that Jesus met with, because they were being pushed by the Pharisees to follow the law. Jesus is coming to really tell them what the law meant, and that the law wasn't about rules. It was about living. It was about living in a certain way, which included meekness. He exemplified meekness and confused the heck out of them, even to the point of dying, and which really wasn't. I mean, his life was not about dying. It was about living in a certain way that had a consequence of death. Dying wasn't the point of the life. It was faithfulness to God and to this whole idea of nonviolent living. And so that being caught between the Pharisees and their ideas of their exceptionalism, and therefore the Jewish exceptionalism, and Jesus, who is saying, this isn't about just you or us, it's about everybody, and God is bigger than all of that. That must have been so confusing to be in the middle of that.
Yes, because part of the legacy of the Pharisees is that they emerged out of the Hasmonean dynasty. Now that's not, oh no, more words, more history. It's simple, okay? Before Herod the Great and after the Maccabees, so this is 2nd century BCE, like 160, something like around there.
Right.
That they had a period finally of success in Israel where they had control and they had people in power who were Jewish, not puppet kings, not being exiled, not all this stuff. They had something, and that family was the Hasmonean, part of the Hasmonean dynasty. And so that was a period of perceived success, the glory days, so to speak, okay? Hey, we talk about the glory days all the time in this country. For a lot of y'all, it's 1950s, okay? And then you go watch the movies and you learn what it was really like, and then it changes. It gets confusing, doesn't it? But so that's part of the legacy of the Pharisees. They were looking back to that time that they wanted to get back to. Their intentions were good. They wanted, and people wanted that. And you're darn right that Jesus comes and muddies up those waters, because he starts telling the people and the leadership that it's not about what we've been told. It's not about getting back to those days when we had it, when it was so good. It's not about that. It's about changing our whole approach to doing what we do, to living how we live, to worshiping how, all of it. So it really was absolutely confusing. And, it's much the same today, because we still receive those narratives, those same patterns, those same ways that we tend to identify certain times of our lives or times in our history and hold on to those as being exemplary, or we look to create things within ourselves that are much more selfishly motivated when we're honest, and we're taught sometimes to operate that way. And so it's with humility and meekness that we can start examining. It's through prayer life, it's through community, it's through just honesty. And again, none of this is intended to say you're bad, you're good, it's recognizing that we learn how to be followers of Jesus by practicing some of these radical things. And part of what enables us to practice it is recognizing that they really are radical. It's not easy. It's not supposed to be easy. And if it is easy for us to follow, then we're probably missing something. Horty?
It reminds me of how often people say, I can't wait for things to get back to normal now.
Yeah, same tendency.
What are we wanting to return to? And is it really a quality of life we want to recreate or emulate?
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
We've been invited into that conversation, and I hope that we continue it, because sometimes to get back to normal, it means different things to different people. But what is normal anymore? And as you say, what do we want to get back to? Jesus doesn't want us to focus that way. He's saying in these Beatitudes, no, focus on something completely different. Let go of some of those things that have oriented your life, when you look honestly at how you've been living, and identify these things and live into these things to help shape something bigger, something more beautiful, something that is greater. Yeah, it might put you at risk, for sure. It might make some uncomfortable situations, in your life. It might put your life on the line. Certainly did for he and a lot of the early followers, and a lot of folks we can name in history. All those good people that Patty just named, Romero, MLK, Gandhi. The world doesn't like prophets like that who speak the truth.
Yeah.
It's what we do because we're afraid, because power wants to hold on to what it has. It's a natural tendency. And all of us who are watching this have a measure of that power. And only until we see that privilege can we even begin to identify how to let that power go and operate from a whole different viewpoint. Bob?
We were watching a show last night on PBS about Billy Graham. And one of the things I found interesting was early in his career, he believed that Chinese babies who hadn't received the word would not go to heaven. And then he confessed later in his career that he was wrong on that.
Yeah. And he really, a profound life and in a very public ministry in ways that many ministers just don't get to that point. So he was sort of viewed in such a, scrutinized in so many ways. But yeah, that was a profound moment of humility. And yet you see then how things, now that he's gone and we still hear parts of his voice, but then things from, like, say, his son or different, he can be reinterpreted and re-examined. And it's just, and we did the same thing with Jesus. How do we mess that up? Well, we became the church. That's part of it.
That's right.
That's and there's a lot that we could go there, and we've talked about that before, but that's part of that's our humanity happening. And so operating from a place of humility serves not only the Billy Grahams of this world, but it's really such an important quality for each one of us to stay in that meekness, to stay in these places where it's not all about us, and we really, it keeps our focus much broader. So great conversation about that particular beatitude. I'd like to move into the next one. And ask you, when you hear, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, they shall have their fill. What does that mean to you? And even what does the word righteousness mean again? You know, there's not one definition for righteousness, but when you hear that, you know, what does it mean? Go ahead, Patty.
You tell me to stop if I'm doing too much, okay? Because I can talk forever. But the Aramaic word for righteousness is kanutha, and it has a whole bunch of meanings. Justice is one of them, and truth is another one of them. So that's really interesting to me, that when we're hungering, and I think we are hungering for truth. I think that's why we're here. We're trying to find out. And truth isn't one thing. It's a composition of things that is ongoing and evolving. That's why God is still speaking in this church. Truth comes out of a God that's still speaking. It isn't set. And then justice. Justice for me has to do with equity. It has to do with understanding that it's our Father. The our is all of us. And the balance is that unless there's equity, things fall apart.
Yeah.
We have climate change. We have people getting killed with kneeling on their throats. We have a lot of anger. I mean, maybe the pandemic is one of the biggest blessings that allows us not to go back to where we were. You know, and I think it's also, justice is also about the questioning, being willing to question. I think about the idea of supporting people from the bottom versus trickle down ideas, and where do we stand? I mean, this is really what it's about, to look at justice, to really question our whole notions of how life is and what creates the justice that God is talking about.
Amen. And not only in Aramaic, but in the Greek. It can be the word that's translated as righteousness can also be translated as justice. And I think that's a little bit clearer for us. But although I love the word righteousness, I used to think it was righteousness being like self-righteous. And that's a very, very limited definition for that word. It's much more rich than that. But yes, it invites us in that space of acting in ways of justice. And as Patty also said, equity or balance, fairness. Okay, so that speaks to what we were talking about before, you know, with that way of living that seeks to be meek and not all hoarding and claiming for myself, because one can't be meek, or, you know, meekness enables you to live with this way of focusing on justice or righteousness. But when you hear also with that, and thank you, Patty, when you hear the Beatitude, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. What does that mean to you? Who do you think of who does that bring to mind when you think of someone that's hungering and thirsting for righteousness? Jane?
So for me, I just broke down the first part to hunger and thirst, and hunger and thirst are two of the most basic needs we have to survive, as is shelter. And, you know, we learn all that kind of stuff. So righteousness to me isn't self-righteousness, but that we have a deep, deep need to find a way of justice and equity and love and compassion. And only, you know, and so that is just for me, it's any of us that are just really, that's a basic need, a real deep need for us.
That's and I'm glad to hear you speak to that, because I agree. That is where I believe that this is pointing us. For whatever reason, when I was growing up, and I don't know if I was taught this or just when I read it, I tended to make the Beatitudes always about someone else. It was somehow I received that's about someone else. So I remember when I would hear this, blessed are the poor, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, I always thought about those people who are just longing for justice, longing for their lives to be made right. You know, the ones that were lacking, you know, that I could go and help, maybe that sort of thing. Okay. And that's just, to me, it's an incomplete there once again, because much more like what you're saying, Jane, to hunger and thirst for righteousness is more about, okay, those most basic of human desires, hunger and thirst, in your own lives, what do you find you hunger and thirst for? Okay. Hey, it could be the new car, could be the great house, could be the TV, could lots of things. Okay. We all hunger and thirst for all sorts of different things. But what he's saying here is, okay, when your hunger and your thirst is for righteousness, is for justice, is for fairness and equity, that's when you got something. Not the transient stuff of this world, not the possessions, not the stuff that we're taught that we're supposed to, we're programmed. We're programmed to want, to desire all these things.
Well, and my translation says, you shall be satisfied. And to me, it's when you have that hunger and thirst for those things and you're trying to live that way.
Yes.
You're more content. You're more you're feeling like your heart is more aligned with your creator,
Yes.
So.
Yes. I love that. And it is, the NRSV is they shall have their fill, but that to be satisfied. And in fact, I found a quote from Richard Rohr about this beatitude, and I'd love to hear your reflection on it. He says, Jesus is giving us the message. Make sure you're not satisfied. Keep yourself in a state of deliberate dissatisfaction. What do you think he's getting at there?
I think he's getting at what John Lewis talked about, that the good trouble. That he exemplified what you're talking about, Jane, but he was not going to just be complacent. We had to keep finding good trouble.
Well, it's because we're always becoming and evolving, and we never just, once we're stagnant and sit still in a place, because there's always new opportunities and new ways that we need to be acting out that righteousness.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, when we become satisfied, when we become too comfortable, it generally doesn't lead us to places of growth or even the ability to hear or witness to others' realities outside of us. We just get ourselves kind of, planted and bubbled, in our little bubble. That can happen. So yeah, that sense of not being too satisfied, too comfortable. Marilyn? Unmute. We don't like to miss anything.
You can't read my lips, huh?
Oh, we were trying.
I think it relates to what we were talking about before. Do we really want to go back to the way things were before we had the pandemic? Boy, I sure don't. I mean, I hunger and thirst after, I guess, becoming more righteous. I don't know. I can't think of a better way to describe it. That's that important to me. I don't want to go back to the way things were before.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's kind of what Richard Rohr is talking about. Like, don't stay in some measure of dissatisfaction. Don't just fall back into old patterns, but focus on, as others have said, the pandemic has been a time that's invited us to look more deeply at the things, at how we live, at what we long for, or what we think makes life meaningful. And people like Rohr and some of the mystics and anyone that's a practitioner of sort of the spiritual life recognizes that it's more than that. It's more than just kind of like the stuff that feeds our bellies, but what is it that brings us into union and communion with God, with something greater than ourselves? And so that's what I hear in part, Marilyn, when you speak about, I don't want to go back to the places of just kind of it being status quo or whatever it was. No, I want to grow through this and long for a creation of something more ultimate. Barb, and then Bonnie.
I guess thinking on this whole period of being stuck in your house by yourselves, my whole wish is that from this, we would truly learn what community is, and learn about caring for each other, and learn about caring for the creatures of the earth and the trees and everything. And that to me is what I hope, that at the end of this, that there will be some more of that. And I'm hoping in my own little neighborhood, which is just right around me, that I will work toward knowing my neighbors and helping if they have a need. And that's it for me.
Yeah, that's a huge shift, right? Just shifting the way we live in the various circles in which we live. And there's a lot of reason to hope, because I have seen growth. Yes, we hear stories of disunity, of discord, of anger, and that's real. That's part of it. But what's also just as real is there are so many ways that we have stepped up on behalf of our neighbors as we have helped one another through this difficult time. Many of you have lived through other times, generationally, World War II, Great Depression, times when we needed to step up to love our neighbor and get outside of ourselves, because we realized, oh my goodness, we can't do it alone. And the pandemic certainly has been a clarifier for that. And that's where I pray, along with Marilyn and all of you, that we don't just get back to that other way of being, living with blinders, but we're actually living and knowing our neighbors, so that when other things start to happen, when cracks or breaks happen, that we have a relationship that's there and that need not even be asked. It's just there. To cultivate that is part of what living the Jesus life is about. Because it's not just about waiting until things fall apart and then calling on our neighbors. Well, what kind of a neighbor will we have unless we've cultivated that? You know, we won't know our neighbors. How will they know to help? That sort of thing. Anyone else on this particular beatitude? Did I miss someone, Bonnie? I think, yeah, you had your hand up.
I'm probably going off topic again, and I hope this doesn't sound political, but I think we're a small enough group and we've been together long enough that I can voice my opinion. But, and I don't mean this politically, but I was reading something yesterday that AOC said, and she said people have told her that she should go back to where she came from, meaning she should go back to being a waitress. And she said, do you think that because I'm now in Congress, I'm better than everyone who is now a waitress, you know? And I think we have this tendency, and I could think of other examples besides her, but she just said that when you sort of step up in your profession, you're better than the people that are quote unquote lower than you. So obviously if you're in Congress, you're better than people who might be working for minimum wage and tips or something. And or if you're the boss is somehow better than the secretary, or whatever the example that we can think of, which is missing the entire point of a person's value and of a person's being, just based on whatever job they happen to have. That's all.
Well, absolutely. First of all, yes, in this small group, that to share something political is not a problem. I mean, the hundreds of thousands of people who are watching this video afterwards, there might be some people who disagree with some of the examples, but I think you're right. And part of what's happening there, let's face it, when power is challenged, it often attempts to silence. It's a way of wielding power, of sort of eradicating disagreement. And part of what I hope we're learning is that disagreeing with love and respect is what's necessary, and being able to appreciate one another's viewpoint without dismissal or eradication is one of the ways. I mean, it's necessary for us to have a shared vision for life together. It's part and parcel. So that has been a part that's very much been lacking. Horty?
Again, I want to read from the Prayers of the Cosmos because I've just been so in love with it lately. Healed are those who persistently feel inside, if only I could find new strength and a clear purpose on which to base my life. They shall be embraced by birthing power.
By birthing power?
Mhm.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So that, again, when I'm watching and looking for what's throwing things out of balance, it allows us in that question to find some degree of answer that's out there that maybe we haven't discovered previously.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's part of the openness. This way of living, all of these Beatitudes create a spirit of openness to that new way. They really are seeking to break open, to keep breaking us open. And so they are, in a sense, guards against the insularity or the containment of what we think the truth is, that Jesus came to break it wide open. That's the throwing over of the tables, in a sense, that it's not about containing God in a temple. It's not about charging money to access God. It's not about any of that. It's about a way of living in communion with one another and with God. Let's get to the last beatitude, because I don't want to kind of give it short shrift, but I see our time here, and thank you for this rich conversation to this point. But mercy, blessed are those who are merciful, for they shall receive mercy. What is mercy? When you hear mercy, what does it look like? What do you think of when you hear the word mercy?
Compassion.
Compassion. Anyone else?
Forgiveness.
Forgiveness. Yeah, I think there's a profound connection between mercy and both of those words. And in much like forgiveness, mercy is something that is unearned, undeserved, and not owed. Okay? And here's the thing about mercy. There's a mysterious quality to it. If we feel like we're supposed to be merciful, if we get into that space of, well, I should be merciful, then we're not. Unless mercy is all about unearned, undeserved, nothing owed in return. Only if it's natural, coming out with no sense of obligation or shoulds, only when it's that is it truly mercy. Otherwise, it's just something else. It's something else. As a mystery, there's a mysterious quality about it. And forgiveness is like that. And both of those, to practice true mercy like that, that's where compassion emerges. But even the word compassion can kind of become, for some, depending on the way we practice it, it can look like pity, or it can look like doing something to elevate ourselves, that sort of thing. It's a word that doesn't necessarily, it doesn't presume that, but it can be moved a little bit. But the word mercy and forgiveness, they're very specific, and again, mysteriously specific. Any comments or thoughts about mercy? Margaret?
Kind. Just be kind.
Yeah. Kindness that emerges from here because it's your way of being. It's your natural way of being.
You're
right.
not asking me.
Right. Not because, well, mommy told me to be kind. Look, we learn that way, but ultimately true kindness, true mercy is not because mommy told me to. It's because what we learn is this is the way of living that is life-giving. This is what makes me alive, not feel alive, but be alive. This is what brings mutual blessing to the world, is living that way. Meekness, having strength that need not be shown off. but that is humble and satisfied with having no attention paid to it. Kindness is like that. You know, when we act with mercy, we don't draw attention to ourselves. It's not about the prayers like later on in Matthew, where he's like, you know, all the ones that say, Lord, Lord, and Jesus is like, that is just lip service, and that is rejected if it's not coming from the heart of mercy. If it's not coming from that place of real, genuine offering with no expectation. Not an easy place to be. But that's why forgiveness and mercy are very, very difficult, radical ways of living. Did you have your hand up again, Margaret? Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, it makes you feel good when you're kind to somebody. You don't expect anything. You just want to give.
It does. But, you know, sometimes that's a hard-earned lesson, isn't it, Margaret? Because how many of us are even at this point right now in our lives where we are refusing to forgive that one person because we're holding on to that last knot in the rope of our power and our control over that situation? And to be kind and to let that go, to be merciful or forgiving in that instance, is to give up the power that we so long for and we think is so important to us. But only when we take that risk and do that can we experience what you just said, how beautiful and life-giving and liberating for all involved that way of being is. It's liberating. It is freeing. It breaks the chains, because that's the truth that we forget time and again, that refusal to forgive, refusal to be merciful is like wearing shackles on our own wrists and ankles. We forget that. We think it's all about the other person. No, we're just keeping ourselves imprisoned.
Yeah.
To be merciful is incredibly radical, just like being forgiving.
Bible study. Can I call you in a few minutes?
Oh, here's another quote I found from Richard Rohr, who's talking about mercy here, and I wanted to get your feedback on this. And I wonder if you can relate to some of what he says here. He says, I once saw God's mercy as patient, benevolent tolerance, a kind of grudging forgiveness. But now, mercy has become for me God's very self-understanding, a loving allowing, a willing breaking of the rules by the one who made the rules. A wink and a smile, a firm and joyful taking of our hand while we clutch at our sins and gaze at God in desire and disbelief. So many things have now become signs for me of this abundant mercy, not grudgingly extended, but patiently offered to this church, to this age, to each of us. As we grow older, it almost takes more and more humility to receive the mercy of God. What do you think of that?
I like it.
Richard Rohr is hard not to love, I find. But yeah, any other thoughts on that? Go ahead, Margaret, and then Barbara, and then Patty.
Well, as I go older and older, I realize that. You know, I spent so much time not giving or forgiving. I'm really sorry for that. But it took me a long time. And I figured that's why God left me here. He says, Margaret, you gotta learn some more.
Amen.
Bye.
Well, we're thankful. We're thankful that you're here. We're thankful that you're still learning, because you set an example for all of us. And that's so true. When I saw that wink and a smile kind of line, it made me think of grandparents, you know, and just that way that grandparents have of kind of breaking the rules with love. And that I loved that image that he wrote about there. Barb?
Well, I've been going through some old journals that I've written over many years, and I'm finding I have spent earlier on, I spent a lot of time just ranting and raving, and I guess it was cathartic for me in my journals. But I have gotten past that, and I see that as I've grown older, I guess I could have become bitter and just kept going in the same way. But at some point, I learned about forgiveness and for myself, and I learned about forgiving others, and that has made the big difference, I think.
Yeah.
Looking back on all those years of ranting and raving and being super ultra righteous in my own mind.
Yeah. Well, and that
just, yeah.
That act of looking back at yourself and your expression with such humility is a powerful thing to do. And I often think one of the best reasons to write our journals is to give us a perspective, a snapshot back on ourselves as we move into different ages of our lives. But you bring up something that's true for all of us, and that is life is fraught with risk, no matter what the choices we make, because for each story that reflects what Barbara just said about the choice that she made to move into a way of being more forgiving, there are people who are likewise more bitter, who have not found that ability. And again, it's not an accusatory thing. I find that people long for something different, but they don't know how. Or there's a certain comfort that we have in the well-worn blankets of our bitterness and our control and the power that we wield, and we wear them like they protect us when they really are just protecting us from growing and from expanding. And some people are satisfied with that, but that's that choice or that way of being. Again, because it's not always a choice for everybody, but that way of being in the world is true for a lot of people, and we don't receive always the message or the understanding of how liberating being forgiving and merciful and letting go, how liberating that really is. I saw Patty's hand and then Horty.
I think about how neurologically we're controlled, and that what we practice gets stronger. And I'm thinking about what you're talking about in terms of the way we defend ourselves from receiving mercy, and especially to ourselves, to practice different pathways, to create neurological pathways that don't let us react automatically in the way we always have. It takes a great deal of strength and practice. And one of the things that they talk about in this book that I'm reading, that the root of the word for mercy, it comes from love, which is God, the idea of God. But he also talks about it as practical compassion. And I like that idea of practical compassion, because it's not just sentimental.
No,
it's what Jesus was talking about when he said, if you follow my teachings with anybody, then you're my brother and sister. Right. That I never get those things right in my memory, but I get the idea. And so that's what it seems to me.
But it's not about feelings. It's about living. It's about a way of being with one another that leads us to that place of blessing.
And I think of some of my patients, I always dealt with catastrophic injuries. And some of the people that I worked with had really big problems of alcoholism and drugs and that kind of thing. And yet some of them, I would work with people over time because the kinds of injuries they had. And after long periods of times, there was change. There could be change, but there had to be support for it. And there had to be pathways set. I mean, to go from being an alcoholic and a drug addict in itself takes changes in the neurological pathways. But those changes happen when we get ourselves in situations that break us open.
Right.
And they're miraculous. They're miraculous when they happen. And they happen because somebody is willing to be there for the other person, despite the fact that they may scare them to death.
Yeah.
They may be hard. I can remember one patient that I had that the doctors would not see unless I was there, ever, because he was so volatile.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I mean, I didn't know if he was going to be volatile or not with me, but that's what happened. And when you see that going with someone, that may be all you have to do.
Right.
That may be mercy.
Right. But that willingness to take that act, to make that move. And I want to just say one more thing. You talked in the beginning about the practices that we take on and the images or the things that we cultivate within ourselves. I've known people who decided to get rid of all the mirrors in their house because the mirror was too much of an encouragement to care about yourself for the sense of worrying about what others think. I've known people who have approached, who refuse to watch any commercials or read any magazines with advertisements because advertisements are inherently playing on our sense of lack or our sense of what is wrong with us, that we might find something that will make it better. And it sort of feeds those mentalities that leave us hanging on to something, that possessiveness, that longing. So it's not to say that one of those is best, but it speaks to the fact that it can be hard work to cultivate these practices, to learn mercy for oneself, for ourselves, as well as others. To really, and that is often a lifelong journey, and it's enhanced by community for sure. Horty?
Well, of the 87 things that crossed my mind, one of the things when we were talking about forgiveness, as you say, holding on to that last knot in the cord of difficulty, the power in that is I want the power to be right. And letting go of that, my perspective is not right. I can let go of that is a huge piece of forgiveness. Mm-hmm. That there's a bigger rightness in the universe than my perspective. And I can let go of that.
Yeah. But that's a hard one, because we confront that all the time. I have a strong need within me to be right. And I recognize that. And so it's, that's why I love trivia night at Crooked Lane on Thursdays, because I get all excited when we win. I'm a competitive person. But the truth is, there are, on a more important level, it comes down to that old adage that there are many times in our lives when it's you can't be both right and in relationship. And learning how to be merciful and learning how to be forgiving, again, both for ourselves, within ourselves and towards others, is what enables relationship to thrive instead of rightness or self-righteousness or all those qualities that they lead to individualism. They do not lead to connection within community too often. So this is how we learn, isn't it? We learn by bumping our heads. We learn by tripping up, and learning to not judge ourselves for that, but to see the powerful witness that those bumps and bruises and trips and stumbles can create. Learning how to see the world that way is itself a profound engagement with a lot of the themes that the Beatitudes embody. Bob?
I didn't get the last sentence that you read about as we get older, it is harder to.
Oh, yeah. So, what he says and what he ended with, and I'm glad you picked up on that. He said, as we grow older, it almost takes more and more humility to receive the mercy of God. What do you think about that?
Well, I guess maybe he's talking about the realization of mercy is, as we get older, we realize how difficult that is.
I think that's a big part of it. That's what I was hearing resonating in Margaret's comments, that it takes us our lives sometimes, or to different times in our lives when we look back and we realize, wow, I wasn't operating from that place of forgiveness, of mercy, of compassion, of these things we long for. And that was within her heart to do that. Again, if it's a sense of obligation, then that's not what it's about. We're missing it. But he's talking about that it takes so much more humility, because it's humility that enables us to receive the paths of our lives and the mistakes we've made, and to recognize them for what they are. They were opportunities. They were parts of our path that brought us to where we are. They need not be judged. They need not create shame that overwhelms us. Again, some shame is okay. Shame that engenders transformation is powerful, but not just to wallow in it, not just to be stuck there. No, it's to say that it takes deep humility to then look back and then to receive the mercy of God in this case, and then move on into growing into mercy in our own lives. Horty, did you want to say anything? I saw you smiling with your hand up.
What crossed my mind when you were talking about the difficulty of receiving the mercy of God is that the older I get, the more mistakes I realize I've really made.
That's it.
There's this increasing treasure trove of ways that I did not take advantage of that in that way. Something else I just wanted to say was, I have in my own personal life been so enriched by learning about meditation. And this sort of addresses what Patty was talking about, our neurological reprogramming, and that we are programmed neurologically to respond to threat instantly for survival. And in beginning to meditate and slowing down our monkey mind, we realize there is a moment between stimulus and reaction, and it can become stimulus and response. That we do have a nanosecond that we've not been aware of, to be in the present and to move forward from that, rather than just the response that might be based in fear and threat.
Amen. And I think that summarizes in part what the intention of the Beatitudes as a whole is. It's really a way of Jesus offering a new programming for us, a new way of staking a claim in who we are and who we long to be. So again, both who we are now, but who we want to be, who we create. And so again, the Beatitudes don't just name what is, but they name what can be. And it's powerful when we embody these qualities. So these are there are marching orders in a lot of ways. You want to walk with Jesus. Okay, this is what it looks like. Again, not to say that it's defining it. It's not all that it is, but it sure describes it in the way that a master painter, can paint a sunrise. It's not all that it is, but man, that's a beautiful expression of it. Powerful. Patty?
I like a quote from Einstein, which I don't have the exact quote, but one of the things he said is that our mistakes are really guideposts to further understanding. And to see them that way is hard in our society because it's so down on mistakes.
Right.
But realizing that every single time that we get a no answer, it's a permission to other answers.
Right.
And I think the one thing that this pandemic has done is slow us down to a place where we might even consider meditating, as you said, Horty, that we had to think differently. We couldn't distract ourselves with all the things we used to do. And
Right.
that changes the neurology. It just does. That's why I don't think we can go back. I'm glad.
Yeah. Amen to that. And I think that actually was Boyce Baldwin, not Einstein, who came up with that one. I could be wrong, but
I'll have to look him up.
No, he's right. He's right above you.
Yeah,
At
I
least
know.
on my screen. Oh, okay.
I know. I'm being funny. I don't be funny very
I got
much.
you. I want to make sure you knew who he was.
He's
Well, friends,
He's just a long hair. You can't listen to him.
Yeah, right. He's just a hippie.
Compatriot.
That's it. Any closing comments? This has been a really wonderful a rich conversation today.
Yeah.
Just thank you,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all for creating this space, and I look forward to seeing you. I'm intending to meet next week, but it may be that we push it off a week. It just depends on some things that are happening Tuesday morning that I might have to be attentive to. So I will let you know in advance, but we'll plan. We have one more session. So thank you all, and until next time, be in Christ's light.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.